So during the High Empire, Rome's territory expanded to the largest land area that it would reach, and it was at the height of its power. This is during the 2nd century, so Hadrian, Trajan, and the Antonines would rule during this time period, and definitely the Germanic peoples in Europe, the Berbers in Africa, and the Parthians and Persians in the east were still regularly warring with Rome, but to no avail. Rome was just too powerful, even with those outside forces pushing on it all the time. So Pax Romana, which we mentioned earlier, or Roman peace, was still going strong. So if you were under the umbrella of the Roman territory during this time, Rome could offer you peace. And it was funny because they achieved peace through violent and warring ways, but they had a very strong military. And so if you were part of the Roman Empire, you were protected, in theory, by the Roman army or military. So we'll kind of talk about Trajan. So Domitian, who we talked about earlier, was the son of Vespasian and was the younger brother of Titus. And he was basically as extravagant as Nero. And this angered the Roman Senate, and they ended up assassinating Domitian and placed one of their own in charge, which was an elderly man named Nerva. And he didn't last long. He did appoint Trajan to take over after him, and Trajan was the first non-Roman to rule. He was actually born in Spain. He was a general, and he was very successful in expanding the Roman Empire further, and he was very popular with the Senate and became known as one of the most successful emperors in a long time, along with Augustus, actually. So Augustus and Trajan became kind of like the benchmarks for successful Roman emperors, and a lot of emperors actually measured themselves against Trajan and Augustus moving forward. So we'll talk about Timgad. This is a satellite view. This is in Algeria, founded in 100 CE, and this was founded by Trajan. It was a new colony at the time, and it was for veterans. And it was located in today what is Algeria, and it's laid out like the Romans laid out their military encampments. And the military encampments were called castrum. And it was basically laid out on this strict grid system with a forum at the intersection, I believe it might be here, of the two main thoroughfares. So one road would be called the Cardo, and the other would be called the Decumanthus. Decumanthus, I believe. And so the Romans laid out their cities in this organized way, and it was definitely influenced by the Greek plans. But actually, the Romans were even more organized about how they laid out their cities. And this grid system does illustrate how organized the Roman Empire was. And even Timgad eventually grew so fast that the later parts actually grew out pretty haphazardly and didn't follow the grid plan as was planned. But that was when they really had a burst in population, and it became, kind of went out of control. But definitely the part that was built in the beginning was very organized. Let's see here. So we're going to talk about the Forum of Trajan. So I'll move here. So Trajan's most important building project was definitely this huge new forum that was about twice the size of the Forum of Augustus. And it glorified Trajan's victories in 2 wars, which the spoils of these 2 wars actually paid for Trajan's building program in the capital. And Apollodorus of Damascus was the architect. And the Forum of Trajan was pretty typical, except instead of a temple, there was this huge basilica, which is number 4 here, that dominated the open square. So here's the open square, but it really dominated, the basilica did, instead of a temple. And a temple was eventually added after Trajan's death, which is number 1 here behind the basilica. And it's actually dedicated to him, to Trajan, because after death, Trajan became a god, much like many of the emperors before him. The Roman emperors, after they died, typically would become gods, unless they were enemies of the Senate. Number 3, there's 2 libraries, so there's 2 number 3s. Those are libraries on either side of the column of Trajan here, which is number 2. And we looked at that earlier. And number 6 is the equestrian statue that once stood here of Trajan. And there were other statues of captive Dacians above the columns in the Forum porticos, so probably, above here possibly. So the entrance to the Forum was a large passageway that resembled a triumphal arch, which is very Roman in nature, the arch. 2 aisles flanked the nave on each side. The basilica was entered through doorways on the long side facing the Forum here. And the building was vast. I think it was about 400 feet long and 200 feet wide. And light entered through clerestory windows, made possible by elevating the timber-roofed nave above the colonnaded aisles. And which the clerestory is an Egyptian invention, so they're using some Egyptian things in the building of this Forum. So we'll actually talk about the column of Trajan next. So the column is actually located behind the basilica, and it stands there to this day. We actually looked at this earlier, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail. And while the basilica is in ruins, the column is still there. And it used to have a nude statue of Trajan on top, but that was later replaced by a saint. So the nude column of Trajan is no longer there, or the nude statue is no longer on top of the column. So the tall column was decorated with motifs documenting Trajan's defeat of the Dacians, which was another culture. And the column also served as Trajan's tomb. So, and the frieze of the column winds around the cylinder and really shows this pictorial record of Trajan's military achievements. And this is thought to be the idea of the architect Apollodorus. And it's basically kind of the first time that this shows up, and it's actually copied many times in history after this point. So building it was really not an easy feat. The marble column that made up the column of Trajan had to be hollowed out and in pieces and drums. So they had sections of drums that were hollowed out and stacked on top of each other. And then an interior included a spiral staircase that went all the way to the top. And then carvers actually worked from the top down. So the top was actually the end of the narrative story, but that's where the carvers started. And then they worked their way down. And then the falling pieces of marble would not damage anything below. If they had started below and carved up, the falling pieces of marble would have damaged the reliefs below. So they started from the top and went down. And it's kind of like a scroll laid out on basically a stone scroll wound around a column. So the reliefs show 2 campaigns against the Dacians and 150 scenes. There's 2,500 figures total on the column. And the band increases in width as you go up. So that really ensures that the uppermost reliefs can be seen from the ground. And the relief is quite low so that the shadows don't distort the column too much. And it would have been hard to read from beginning to end from the ground. But it was originally painted. And the scenes are usually showing, Trajan addressing his troops, sacrificing to the gods. It also shows the battle and the aftermath. But that only takes up about a quarter. The battle and the aftermath of the battle take up only about a quarter of the frieze, which is accurate because Romans actually spent most of their time preparing for battle and transporting and building more than they actually spent fighting. So we'll go over the markets of Trajan. So this is the battle and the aftermath. Wounded Romans. Construction. Okay, so we're going to talk about the markets of Trajan. They were built on a hill which overlooked the Forum, and shops and administrative offices were basically housed in this market. And the shops were single rooms covered by a barrel vault, and they were called taberna. And the shops were on several levels, and either opened up into a concave semicircular facade, which is here, or they opened up into the interior indoor market hall, or onto the street further up the hill. So the market hall, actually resembles a modern mall, and it has 2 levels. And the uppermost level is actually set back and lit by these skylights. And then there's these groin vaults running down the length of this hall that actually help the light from the skylights get into actually the lower story as well. So we'll talk about Hadrian next. Still have a little bit of time. So Hadrian was appointed by Trajan, and he was also a Spaniard, and he was a lover of the arts and was a huge fan of Greece. There are many portraits of Hadrian. The only other emperor with more portraits is Augustus. Hadrian is shown as a mature man in his portraits, but one that never ages past a certain age. So we'll take a look at a portrait bust of Hadrian from Rome, Italy, 117 to 120 BCE, marble. So if we look at this portrait, it does resemble the Greek portrait of Pericles, who also wore a beard. And it's done in that style that Pericles was done in, the classical style of Athens, Greece. Whereas, Augustus's portraits resembled the idealized, perfect, youthful, clean-shaven athlete of Greece. Hadrian, his portraits were Greek classical statues featuring the matured, bearded adult, much like Pericles was shown in his portrait. And before this, emperors were not typically shown with beards, but after Hadrian, it became the norm for Roman emperors to be shown with beards. And maybe I'll end that here because we'll talk about the Pantheon in the next video.